So in this session we're going to look at making a 2-zip pouch. Looks like this from the outside. Open it up and you've got these 2 zipped compartments on the inside. I've been using this one to store my rotary cutter and some little snip scissors for when I go and take those bits into the studio for quilt along sessions, but you could use it for absolutely anything. This was an idea originally stolen from somebody who came into one of my workshops, and she kept her little bits and bobs in it, and I thought that's really clever, and it's such a simple make as well. So thank you to her if she's watching. Right, so what do we need? Well, I've made this today, I'm going to make this for you today using 8-inch zips, and it's the size of your zip that's going to determine the size of your pouch. So these are quite fancy zips, and they're just zips that I've got to hand that I'm happy to use. Remember that the length of your zip is stopper to stopper, so that's my 8 inches. The actual tape of the zip is longer, and I just quite like these zips because they've got these fancy pulls on the top which look really nice. So I've got 8-inch zips for me today, which means that my fabric is going to have to be 8.5 inches wide. So I've got 2 fabrics here, a really jazzy one for the outside and a spotty one for the inside. And because my zip is 8 inches, I've cut 8.5 inches wide. The length of this fabric is actually 18 inches. And what you need to remember is that effectively you're folding it in half and in half again. So my finished pouch is going to look something like that. So my fabric's 8.5 wide by 18 long. Next we're going to need some wadding. So I've got a piece of wadding here, and if you can see that, that's actually where I've joined it together. So it's just scraps that I've had in my basket that I've joined together to make one piece. You can do that just by zigzagging down straight edges on your machine. I do recommend cutting yourself some straight edges when you're joining it, otherwise it can be a bit bumpy. If you haven't got wadding at home, you could just use a piece of felt or something that's just got a little bit more weight to it. Sometimes there's odd bits of woolly things laying around. Or you could just make it without. It just wouldn't have as much structure to it. Ideally, if you've got something to put between it, old towels could sometimes be used as well. That's actually 1 inch shorter, if I just show you the top, than the length of my main fabrics, and that will become clear later on. And it's also, if I just show you, slightly wider, and again that will become clearer later on. So that's the wadding. And then the last thing that we need are a couple of strips of fabric which are going to be the binding for the edges going round here. So these are just strips of fabric cut on the straight. There's nothing fancy about them, even though I'm calling them binding. And they are 2.5 inches wide by 10.5 inches long. And I'm 2 of them, and I've already pressed them in half for use later on. So quite a simple set of supplies. We just need 2 zips, 2 pieces of fabric for the outside, something to go in the middle, and then 2 strips of fabric to be our binding. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so to get started on this project, we're going to place our lining fabric on our work surface, right side up. And then we're going to take our first zip and place this on top of the fabric, and we're going to centre the zip. So remember, that's stopper to stopper on top of our lining fabric. And that is also right side up. And then we're going to take our outside fabric and place that down on top of the zipper, right side down, matching up the side edges here and here. So I'm going to pop that in place, and then I'm just going to put some clips on to hold that for me. You could pin it or clip it, whichever way you want to. The most important thing is that when you have pinned or clipped it, you do just flip it over to check that you haven't done this. And if you have done that, just obviously check and put back in place. Okay, so I can now fill the zip through the fabric. I'm going to take it over to the machine and insert the zip. Okay, so here we are at the sewing machine, and I've loaded my zipper foot on so that my needle is coming down to the left hand side, and it's always worth just checking that your needle is going to clear exactly where you're expecting it to before you start sewing. I've had many a broken needle by not checking it was clear. I've now just folding back the first top layer of fabric, and I'm just going to slide that zip pull down just so that I can start to sew the first bit and then move the zip head back up. So I'm just going to lift my presser foot, pop that underneath, and I'm lining up the edge of my presser foot here, the left hand edge, next to the coil of the zip that I'm about to sew in. Just going to lay this all out nice and flat and just start sewing. And do a little bit of reversing. There we go. And I'm just going to come down a little bit further. Okay, I'm going to drop the needle down into the fabric at this point and take this clip out of the way, and I'm just going to fold back the fabric, and I'm now going to close that zip right up. Sometimes when you come to move the zip, you might need to lift your presser foot. It just depends on how big your zip is and your machine. And then I'm going to continue sewing down to the bottom. So I'm feeling the ridge with my fingers, feeding the fabric in nice and straight. Just checking it's all lined up. And when I get to the bottom, just do a little reverse. And there we go. Okay, so our zip is now stitched in, and I'm now just going to turn through the fabric and bring it back, and you'll see that our zip is nicely inserted. Now, because I'm using these fancier zips, you can still see some of the holes through it. So if you were doing this, you might want to actually stitch a little bit closer to the tape. I think I'm going to run another line of stitching down there just so that I've actually covered off those holes in that tape. Okay, so I've now turned this through and you can see my zip's nicely inserted. I've gone really close to the zip because I didn't want any of the holey tape to show, but you don't have to go as close if you don't want to. So now we've got the zip in this end of the fabric, we're going to repeat the process at the other end of the fabric, and just make sure, it's quite nice sometimes to have the zip going in the other direction on the other end, so that when you bring them together you've got one zip going one way and the other zip going the other way. So I'm just going to pin and repeat the process for the other end of the fabric. So as you can see, we've now got a zip in either end of the piece of fabric, and I begin to assemble it, you can begin to see what it's going to look like. So my next job is to press the fabric away from the zip and just do a line of top stitching on the edge of the fabric, and that's going to hold the lining and the outside fabric away from the zip and make sure that it clears nicely. So I'm just going to go to the iron and press it away and then do a bit of top stitching. So to do my top stitching, I've moved my foot over so that my needle is now coming down on the right hand side of the foot, and I'm lining the edge of my foot up with the coil on the zip again, and I now just need to think about my needle position. So top stitching is always a millimetre or two in from the edge that you're top stitching, and it's often done with a slightly longer stitch as well. It looks nicer with a slightly longer stitch. So I'm going to change my stitch length to about 3.5, and I'm just going to check where my needle comes down, and that would be okay, but I think I'm going to just flick it one step across. Hopefully I'll have picked that up on the video. So I'm just going to move back up with my project, find my foot pedal, and then I'm just going to top stitch down, and I've got both layers nicely pressed away from the zip, so I'm not having to worry too much about what the fabric's doing, and I'm just going to go really slowly and go down there. And you can see that that zip head has allowed me to pass, the zipper foot has allowed me to pass all the way past the zip head. And there we've got some beautiful top stitching. Okay, so our top stitching is now done. What we're going to do now is put our layer of wadding between our two fabric layers so we can do this gentle quilting that I've done to this pouch here. So I'm going to take our wadding layer, and we can see now why we cut it a little bit shorter, because it's now more or less the exact length that we need it. And if you remember, we cut it 1 inch shorter, and that's basically taken into account the seam allowances that we have used in inserting the zip at either end. So I'm just going to open up the layers and slide the wadding in between, and then I find it easiest if you just take one end and give it a bit of a shake all the way down to the other end, and then you can start to lay it out. Now, if at this stage you find that your wadding is a little bit too big, it's not a problem. You can just take it out and trim a little bit off. But hopefully you should find that it will fit in. It takes a little bit of jiggling around because you want to get a perfect fit, and it sticks to the fabric. So just be patient and give it a wriggle and a jiggle until you've got a really nice flat piece of quilting and fabric. And it tends to be, once you've got one side done, it tends to smooth across to the other side. Wadding can stretch a little bit as well, so just make sure. There we go. That's nicely inside. So to make sure that none of this moves when we're sewing it, I'm just going to put some pins through it in relatively random places. Doesn't matter that the wadding isn't straight in it at the moment, as long as it's snug and flat, we'll be absolutely fine. And then we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and just lightly quilt it. You could do any quilting that you'd like here. You could do zigzag, diagonal lines going that way and then come back across that way. You could do straight lines going down it. You could do straight lines going across it. But I quite like just being a bit free motion and doing these wiggly lines that go down this one here. So that's what I'll be looking to do on the sewing machine. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine and we've got our normal presser foot back on the sewing machine, and I'm now just going to stitch some lines of quilting, curvy lines randomly across my fabric. When I get to the end, I make sure that I'm on the wadding, and then I can just lift my presser foot, pivot, lower it back down, come down a few stitches, and then I'm ready to quilt back in the opposite direction. And I'm just going to roll my fabric up so it fits in there nicely. And then I can do a random line coming back down. Oops, it's got caught at the back. That's just the fraying edge of my fabric that I didn't clear. There we go. So just some nice curvy lines. This time I get onto the wadding. This time I'm going to hold the fabric like this, and I'm going to reverse a few stitches. Stop, needle back down, twist the fabric, and then I'm going to come back in this direction. Start at a bit of an angle. Finish, pivot, stitch down, needle down, roll it back up and twist it back around and start again. and I'll continue like that all the way across my piece of fabric. Okay, so my fabric is all now quilted with some wavy lines, and I've now got just to straighten up the edges. So if you've got scissors and only access to scissors, you could use scissors to do it. I've got a patchwork ruler and a rotary cutter. So I'm just going to put my ruler on the edge like so. Now, because you've been quilting, you'll find that the edge of the fabric has moved ever so slightly, so that's fine. I'm just going to take a best fit line going down the edge of there. And I'm looking to keep my ruler straight with the zip that I've got at the top, which is just out of shot. So I'm just going to cut down there, just looking to trim off the excess wadding. And then I'm going to flip it round and just do exactly the same coming down the other side. So just get my best fit line, keeping my ruler straight with the zip so I know that I'm not going wonky. Like so. Okay, so what we have to do now is decide our halfway point. So I'm just going to bring my zips so that they're on top of each other like this, and find my fold at the bottom, and I'm just going to pop a pin in there like so to mark it, and then I'm going to bring my pouch out like this. I've got my pin down here, so I'm bringing one zip to that pin, and then I'm bringing the other zip in to the pin. Smooth all my threads out of the way that I've not yet cut. So at this stage, if you had a normal zipper, you could just sit those on top of each other like that and stitch them into place, and that would work really nicely. Because I've got these fancy zippers, you can just see the holes from the zips, so I think I'm actually going to pin a piece of ribbon down there. So one moment, and I'm just going to get a piece of ribbon. Okay, so I've raided my ribbon box and I found this piece of ribbon, which I think will look quite nice down the centre. So the first thing I'm going to do is clip the edges where the folds are, just to hold everything in place. Because otherwise I might find that it moves around a little bit too much. Like so. And then I need to pin this piece of ribbon exactly where I want it. So I just want to make sure that I'm covering up all of the zip and that it's sitting in quite a nice straight line. And if you pull things nice and taut, that tends to help keep it nice and straight. Okay, now this is a point at which to think about your colour of thread. So if I was just stitching the yellow zip, I might want to think about putting a yellow thread in the top of my machine so that the stitch lines are disguised. Underneath, stick with the same colour in your bobbin as you used for your quilting so that it doesn't overly highlight itself. I've got a white thread in my machine at the top, so that's going to be absolutely fine for stitching this down. And I'm going to take this over to the machine and stitch it in place. So I'm at the machine and I've got my normal foot on my sewing machine. I have moved the zip head down so that it's out of the way, otherwise it is going to mess with your foot. Loading the zipper foot on I don't think really actually makes it that much easier at this stage. And then because the main foot is going to come down the centre, but I want 2 lines of stitching on this ribbon, I'm actually going to move my needle across to the right hand side. So that it's coming down right in the edge of the window of my zipper, of my presser foot. And then I'm going to do 1 line of stitching on that side, and then I'll repeat the process coming down the other side of my ribbon. When I get to near my zip head, normal procedure, leave your foot down and leave your needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot and then slide the zip past. Okay, let's get started. Take that pin out the way. actually slide that past. And it's quite nice because the gap of between my two zip coils, two zip ridges, seems to be exactly the same size as my presser foot, so I'm able to run this down really nicely. Just smoothing the ribbon out as I go. That's one side. Then I'm going to go back to the top, put my presser foot back down, and now I'm going to move my needle to the other side. Move the zip head out of the way. Okay, all done. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just trim off these edges. So I'm going to trim off the excess zip tape and also the excess ribbon, so that ends nice and flush. And I'm going to do exactly the same at this end. Oops, can't seem to grab hold of it. Trim that off. And trim that off. Now we're going to attach the binding to the side, and we just need to be really aware of where any stoppers are in case they're going to get in the way of the needle. So I'm just going to open my zips up a little bit so that those are in the middle. And then I've got these binding strips. So these were the original strips at the start, which were 2.5 centimetres wide by approximately 10 centimetres long, and I've pressed those in half, and they're going to become the strips that go down the side of our pouch. Okay, so to attach these strips is going to be just like if you were attaching binding to a quilt. We're going to line up the two raw edges from the fold with the raw edge of our pouch that side, and I'm going to do the same on that side. And notice that I've left a little bit overhanging at both ends. So I'm going to clip those in place. And then I'm going to sew them using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Which should not interfere with that stopper and not interfere with that stopper. 1/4 inch would be just before the stoppers. Okay. So I'm back at the sewing machine, and this time I've loaded a 1/4 inch foot onto my machine, which means it's going to be slightly easier for me to see my 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you haven't got one of those at home, just use your normal markings on your needle plate and that will be absolutely fine. And I'm now just going to sew down, just being really careful just to check as I approach these that I can feel them and the needle is going to miss them. So at this stage I can feel and double check, go really gently. Take that one out and you can see how that's going to fold back. And I'll do the same for the other side. Okay, so our binding strips are now attached, and we've attached them to the inside of our pouch rather than the outside. So what we're going to do now is fold them out, and then at the ends you're going to fold the end over so it's nice and level like this, and then you're going to fold it back on itself. And what you're looking for is for the binding to be level front and back, just like there. And I'm going to pop a clip in that. And then at the other end I'm going to do exactly the same. So the binding is folded over, I'm going to fold it over the end, and then I'm going to fold the end in to meet it and put a clip on that. So I'm going to do that on all four corners to start with. Fold the end of the binding over, fold the binding in. Oops. Like so. And clip. Fold the binding over, fold the binding in, and clip. Okay, and then, oh, I've got a long thread there. Make sure your threads are off so you're not going to trap any. We're folding the binding over so that we're covering the raw edges. And then you can clip in place, like so. Let's bring that back into shot. So I'm bringing the binding over, and then I'm clipping. And you should find that it covers all of your raw edges and any unsightly stitching from before. I'm just going to tidy that end up. Okay, so when it's like this, you've got a choice. You can now either really nicely hand stitch along here and trap this down, which would be a really lovely, nice, neat finish. Or if you fancy, you can do a bit of machine stitching down there. What you have to be really careful of if you're going to do the machine stitching is that, again, you're not going to hit any of the metal stoppers. So to check that your binding hasn't rolled around to the other side too much, put a pin through the edge of your binding on the inside, like so, to mark where that edge is, and then just check where that pin comes out on the other side. And if I bring that up so you can see that pin's just on the edge of the binding. So as long as I stay on the binding with my stitching, I shouldn't interfere with the stoppers that I've got on the other side. So I'm just going to prepare both sides of the pouch like that, and then we'll go back to the sewing machine. So for those of you that aren't so keen on the hand stitching or want a quicker finish to your project, I'm back at the sewing machine, and I've put a normal foot back onto my sewing machine. And you've got a couple of options here. One is that you could do a nice line of straight stitching, just a couple of millimetres in from the edge of your binding, and have a nice line of straight stitching. But sometimes that doesn't line up perfectly with your edge of your binding on the other side, and that really irritates me when it's like that. So a couple of ways of avoiding that issue and embracing the fact that your stitching is going to show on both sides is, one idea is to do several lines of wavy stitching down each piece of binding, a bit like the idea of free motion. And another option would be to zigzag down your binding, and you'll have zigzags showing on either side. If I just show you this one here, I did zigzag on this one, as you can see. That was quite a narrow zigzag in the middle, but it was enough to hold that edge in place. Because I've done zigzag on the other one, I think on this one I'm going to go with some wavy lines of stitching and embrace that idea, and I can show you how to do that. And it'll also fit quite nicely with the quilting that I've done. So starting at the very top, I'm now just going to sew some intentionally wavy lines down my binding. When I get to the end, I'm just going to leave the needle in the fabric, pivot the fabric round, and then come back down again in the other direction. And then at the top, I will leave the needle in, pivot the fabric round, and then just come down with one more line of stitching in a wavy line. There are my wavy lines from the right side, and there are my wavy lines from the inside. So I finished the binding on both sides, and remember you can do it exactly how you want: wavy lines of stitching, zigzags, straight lines on the machine, or hand sewing. So now my pouch is finished. If I wanted to put a popper in it, I could put poppers on either side and measure them in from the edge, top edge and side edges to make sure that they were in the same place, and then it would popper shut. You could at this stage stitch on a little bit of ribbon at the back, and then you could tie it shut, but I'm quite happy with it just folding shut. But in order just to give it a little bit of an encouragement to sit together, I'm just going to fold it in half like this, make sure it is in half, and then I'm just going to go over it with my iron to just give it a little bit of a press into shape. Press the binding as well if there's been any issues with the binding. There. And there we have it, 1 2-zip pouch. I hope you've enjoyed that project too.